Good morning, everyone. I hope that you've had a really great weekend. It's Anna here from Journeys. I'm here to tell you about myth number 3 in our series of Brene Brown's 4 myths of vulnerability. So the first one, if you missed them, you can go back and have a look at the other videos as well. But the first one is that vulnerability is weakness. Actually, it's strength and courage. The second one is that you can opt out of vulnerability. And so we talked about last week that if you're alive, you're vulnerable. And so this week, the third myth is that vulnerability is oversharing, or the vulnerability is letting it all hang out. So you might think, in this day and age of social media, such an online presence for most people, that there's already way too much vulnerability in the world. People are just sharing their deepest, darkest secrets in, every second post kind of thing. And, I think the same thing. There's it's almost kosher at the moment to, share vulnerably or to exercise courage in some way. The interesting thing about that is, in Brene's research, she discovered that actually that's not vulnerability. She talks about how vulnerability minus boundaries is not vulnerability. So when we share those deeper things with the whole world, it's not actually being vulnerable. That is oversharing. And because the things that are closest to us, the things that mean the most to us, are things that only need to be shared with those who are closest to us. We don't need to share all of those with the whole entire world. And so it's interesting that, Brene talks about when vulnerability is shared without boundaries, we're opening ourselves up to be really hurt. And so, being vulnerable, when we go back to the definition, which is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, that, the fact is being alive, being in relationship with people is already really vulnerable. And so when we need or want to share something that's really, really close to us, or something we're really struggling with, there needs to be a huge element of trust within the relationship that you're sharing with. So if you share, the whole concept of oversharing in the idea of, lots of social media and people sharing deeper stuff across the whole world, is that there's actually no trust, or there's limited trust in those relationships with the people that they're sharing with. Because if they've got millions or hundreds of thousands or thousands of people that are on their social media, they can't have a trusting relationship with all of those people. So Brene talks about the fact that vulnerability needs to be done within the confines of a trusting relationship, and there needs to be boundaries in place, that's when true vulnerability can actually be received, and that's the courage, sharing with someone who is closest to you. And sometimes they're the hardest people to share with, because we wonder what they're going to think, and will they still love us, all those sorts of things. So it's interesting. I love what Brene says in Daring Greatly about this. She says, so she talks about how there needs to be a mutuality, and it requires boundaries and trust in order to be vulnerable. And she says the result of this mutually respectful vulnerability is increased connection, trust, and engagement. Vulnerability without boundaries leads to disconnection, distrust, and disengagement. So true vulnerability actually creates connection, trust, and engagement. When we're sharing with someone outside of the confines of trust and boundaries, it actually creates disconnection and disengagement within the relationship. So I want to leave you with that, and it's a bit of a challenging one, I think, to know where's the line between oversharing and being vulnerable. So I want you to think this week about who is it that you can be most vulnerable with? Who is it in your life that you trust the most? And how can you exercise vulnerability within that safe confines of those boundaries and that trusting relationship? So food for thought for you this week. Let me know any questions in the comments or reply to the email. And I hope that you have a great week, and I'll see you next week for our last myth. Bye.